Welcome to Foreign Affairs Live. Foreign Affairs Live is the event series that brings the ideas in Foreign Affairs magazine to a live stage. Tonight is the 50th event that we've done. And this program, in partnership with Google Ideas, is really gratifying because we get to see hundreds of you, our readers, who are so passionate about the magazine. And it's humbling to see the brain power that's in our audience. So thank you for being here and braving the nasty weather. Tonight's event will be live streamed, on the record, and video recorded. And please silence your cell phones. The inspiration for tonight was Jared Cohen's article in the current issue of the magazine. For those of you who didn't get a copy when you were walking in, you can find it on foreignaffairs.com, and for audio files, you can download it in audio. Without further ado, I will introduce Jared Cohen, the director of Google Ideas and an adjunct senior fellow at Council on Foreign Relations. And he will introduce the rest of the panelists. We will have a 45-minute discussion followed by question and answers. Please stand, state your affiliation, and wait for the microphone when it's your turn to answer. And enjoy the program. Take it away, Jared.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you, Foreign Affairs, and all of you for joining us this evening. Before we move to the conversational portion of this, I just wanted to start by making a few brief comments that kind of expand on certain aspects of the article. And I want to start with what I think is an important operating assumption as you think about the multidimensional threat of ISIS, which is they really are the first terrorist organization that has managed to effectively hold both physical and digital territory. And the reason it's important to think of ISIS in this way is I think too often and too commonly we're basically taking the digital aspect of the fight against ISIS and we're making it synonymous with communications, as if technology equals communications, which is just one part of it. And by doing this, it's leading us to sort of fall into this trap of treating counter-narratives as if they're the panacea to the problem that we're seeing with regards to ISIS spilling over into the digital domain. But I think there's a few other assumptions that are important to understand here, which is by talking about a digital counterinsurgency against ISIS and by talking about the digital manifestation of the threat, it by no means is a suggestion that the digital front is more important than the physical front. I don't think anybody's refuting the fact that the physical aspect of the ISIS challenge is the one that is the more pressing and important. But it's also important to acknowledge they're not mutually exclusive. And the digital front, while it may be newer and more complex, it may actually be the area where we're likely to gain the most traction at this current juncture, specifically if you're speaking as somebody not in the public sector. The other thing that's important to really sort of grasp is the fact that if we look at what ISIS is doing online, that's not the anomaly. The anomaly is that ISIS is occupying such vast physical territory. It's a much more unusual metric for a terrorist organization to achieve. And just because the ability to hold digital territory is new, it doesn't mean that that's the sort of special thing that's happening here. I think in many respects, it's more of a harbinger of things to come, and we'll expect more terrorist organizations in the future to have an easier time holding digital territory than physical territory. We also have to distinguish between saying ISIS is good at online marketing and online sales and describing them as tech savvy. Those are two very different things. There's not a lot of evidence right now that ISIS possesses the capability to conduct serious cyber attacks that would have physical domain ramifications. And then a final sort of assumption that I think is important to flag is, I think it's important to speculate about what happens if ISIS is to lose their hold on physical territory and essentially only exists, largely in the digital domain. One of the things that Graeme and I have talked about and we'll flesh out on stage is, could you imagine ISIS arguing that they've fulfilled their territorial requirement that is a necessary step to establishing a caliphate by virtue of their presence online? And we'll sort of debate that a little bit. One of the things that before we all get up on stage, I also want to just underscore is these sort of broad generalizations about ISIS and technology are not particularly prescriptive. So saying that ISIS is all over social media and all over the internet, that's basically as vague and non-prescriptive as saying that ISIS occupies UK-sized territory across Iraq and Syria. Listing all the different apps and platforms that they're on is about as vague as then listing the 12 to 20 cities that they're occupying in those two countries. And when you start talking about, how many Twitter followers they have, when you start talking about how many, accounts they have on, various platforms, that's about as vague as saying they have 20 to 30,000 foreign fighters from 100 different countries that are operating within these territories. So we really have to sort of think at this in a different way and focus on understanding the digital aspect of the challenge by really zeroing in on the tactics that ISIS is using to effectively maintain a presence in the open web. And with that, I'll pause and I'll invite my co-panelists on stage to join me. And David Ignatius has kindly agreed to lead us in conversation, and he'll introduce Kim and Graeme as well. So thank you.
I am the aforementioned David Ignatius. I'm a columnist for the Washington Post. It's wonderful to see this turnout on such a nasty evening. It's a sign of how serious the question is, how troubled we all are by it, how much we're all looking for answers. And I can't think of a better group to help us all think about this than the group that's assembled here. Jared, as you know, is the founder and director of Google Ideas, now part of something that I still haven't quite got my mind around called Alphabet. Kim Kagan is a former West Point military historian who is now the founder and president of the Institute for the Study of War, which, if you try to follow ISIS, if you try to follow events in Iraq and Syria, really is must-reading. And finally, on everybody's must-reading list is Graeme Wood, whose article in The Atlantic, What ISIS Really Wants, remains the touchstone for people who are trying to get their minds around this group. It's amazing to me that months after it was published, it's still the most popular thing on The Atlantic's website, and for good reason. It's very powerful. If you haven't read it yet, when you go home tonight, and it'll take you several days after tonight, delve into it, because it's a real starting point for an intellectual understanding. So I want to begin with Jared, whose article is the reason that we're here. And I just want to note, by way of introduction, that I first heard this article presented in August at one of these wonderful foreign policy events in a beautiful place out west. And I listened to this fantastic presentation, and I did what every columnist would do, which is I went up to Jared afterwards and I said, that would make a great column. Can I steal your ideas? And Jared said, actually, I was sort of thinking of publishing something myself about it. And certainly it makes a better foreign affairs article than it would have made a column, and has been, I think, really powerful. And Jared, I want to ask you to start where you left off in your remarks, and take this idea of the basic concept of counterinsurgency as De Petraeus and others taught it to the country, which is that you want to separate the insurgents from the people. You want to somehow dry up this sea in which the insurgents are swimming. And I want to ask you to take your idea about how you do that separation, or as you put it in your paper, marginalization of ISIS. And specifically, if you would speak to the question of who should do that. Just in the last week, we've seen this, in some ways illegal, certainly outside conventional bounds, group Anonymous volunteer for that job. Say, we want to do what, in effect, what Jared Cohen is describing. Does that make any sense to you? And if not, who do you envision doing this?
Well, I'll start with the anonymous piece, because this has been in the news a lot, especially yesterday. And I think one of the challenges about the digital battlefield is just issues with regards to attribution, right? So, we have to be careful not to assign an organizational structure to Anonymous that, we don't really have any evidence to believe exists. So what Anonymous really is it's a brand. That, and it's a brand that maybe organized groups latch onto to amplify their work, maybe individuals latch onto to amplify their work. It's a set of sort of, almost crowdsourced, values, but it's really unclear who Anonymous is. So when we talk about Anonymous, conducting attacks against ISIS, I'm not sure it's quite that simple. What we can say is there's some number of individuals, maybe it's one person looking like 1,000 online, or maybe it is actually 1,000 online, under the auspices of the Anonymous brand, going after ISIS. Now, one of the sort of complicating aspects of this is even if you sort of assume there's some kind of organized elements that are using the Anonymous brand, I think there's an interesting historic analogy to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, right? Which is, sometimes interests are aligned with organizations, centralized or decentralized, that have a common interest with you. In this case, defeating ISIS, that in the long run don't necessarily share your values. And there's a long history of collaborations, with a short-term mindset focused on defeating a common enemy. And we've had a long history of grappling with: are we prepared for the potential long-term ramifications of getting into bed with organizations that long-term have different aspirations? The question of who does this, I think when you're talking about the digital battlefield, I think you can't have enough sectors and disciplines involved in this, right? So I think it's this sort of classic example of a coalition that cuts across every element of society: the companies, the government, individuals, engineers, hackers, both black hat and white hat. I think everybody's kind of got a role to play, and we've never, if you're looking at the multi-dimensional threat of ISIS, there's not a lot that you can do about the physical battlefield. The average individual, if they possess some kind of technical competence, may actually be able to have an outsized impact on this. The problem is, we may not like the outsized impact that they have. So it's a very crowded counterinsurgency on the digital front, much more so than on the physical front.
And in that crowded battle space, who's going to do the deconflicting, if any is needed? And that leads to the obvious question of what role do you envision for the U.S. government, and specifically for U.S. intelligence agencies that, as we know from the Snowden revelations, have been very active in this digital space. Talk us through those issues.
So, there's a high-level point that I think that the sort of, and Kim's certainly an expert on this. I think if you're conducting any counterinsurgency, whether it's physical or digital, you really need to understand who your adversary is, right? And the problem is we treat the digital foreign fighters who are fighting online on behalf of ISIS as if they're monolithic. But as I say in the article, you have your sort of digital core, the ones with private accounts that try to sort of stay out of the sort of visibility of law enforcement. They have lots of reserve accounts, and they develop the propaganda and disseminate it to another layer, which is the rank and file. These are people who are part of ISIS, either in Iraq or Syria or somewhere else around the world, who are individually operating the accounts, but they have multiple personalities online and have a virtual entourage of about anywhere from like 12 to 50 accounts that they're operating. And then you have all these supporters around the world who are just serving as a massive echo chamber. And then you have the biggest group, and here's where it gets complicated, which is the largest group of digital foreign fighters that are serving as a massive echo chamber for the organization. They're not even human, right? You're talking about software that is maintaining automated accounts in the sort of hundreds of thousands. You're talking about people essentially putting their phones on autopilot with apps that just sort of post and repost everything. And it's sort of like the IED problem, right? If you want to solve the IED problem, you can try to get all the IEDs off the battlefield. You can go after the sort of 16-year-old who's laying the IED for a pack of cigarettes or something else. But at the end of the day, if you really want to solve the IED problem, you have to go after the supply chains and people giving the orders. And so, the answer to this is not, sort of to look at the numbers of accounts. The answer to this is we have to sort of drive a wedge between the humans who are actually operating the accounts and these just sort of automated accounts that are essentially ghosts. And who does this? I think, again, this goes back to the coalition argument. I think with the automated accounts, I think, look, fortunately, private sector companies are heavily incentivized to prevent the proliferation of fake accounts. I'm working really hard on this. I think it's very difficult to convince, if you're the government or the intelligence services, I think it's very difficult to sort of convince somebody who wants to join ISIS to sort of change their mind to not join. I think the more likely scenario is I think government can do a lot to inject risk into the ecosystem. So I'm much more optimistic that you can convince somebody who's trying to join ISIS that they're likely to get caught and arrested before they get there, which is even more humiliating. So one example, just to make it sort of concrete, imagine a situation where, the intelligence community knew, the 100 flight itineraries that, ISIS aspirants were searching for online to try to figure out logistically how to get to Iraq and Syria. And every time somebody searched for one of those complex flight itineraries, they found themselves looking at ads that were really news stories about people who were arrested trying to get to Iraq and Syria because of some flight itinerary that they searched for online. I think that actually has a reasonable chance of freaking somebody out and preventing them from maybe taking that next step.
I'm going to come back to you to talk about one of the really provocative things you say at the end of your article, which is the role that machine learning, artificial intelligence could play in this process. But I want to turn now to Kim. Our subject is digital counterinsurgency, but having one of the real experts about how this battle is playing out on the ground with us, I do want to ask you a couple of questions that really go more to the physical counterinsurgency side of this, starting with Secretary of Defense Ash Carter's announcement today that he is planning to send a new, and I'm quoting, specialized expeditionary targeting force to Iraq, the famous boots on the ground. And that raised the question for me, first, do you as an expert think this is a good idea? Will it be efficacious? And second, who are these people going to be doing targeting for? Do you have confidence yet that they'll be doing targeting for anyone other than us and our NATO allies? Or are there Iraqi forces that they can be lasing targets for or in some other way driving the battlefield for?
I think what makes Jared's article so interesting and what makes ISIS so special as a group is this relationship between what happens on the physical battlefield and what happens out there in the digital battlefield. And one question that we can often ask, or we do often ask at ISW, is what is the connection between the two? Why is ISIS so resonant? Why is its message so resonant? And part of it is the technical means and the fact that we have essentially an organization that has digital natives, that has grown up in a new environment, in a new universe, that is savvy in the social media sphere. But part of it is because they actually have a very simple message about the caliphate and its existence and the need to defend it, that they can communicate in this resonant fashion. And so it is very important to talk about the physical space of Iraq and Syria when we're talking about the digital space, because we can't defeat ISIS only online, nor do I think we can entirely defeat ISIS only physically. We actually have to snap the reality that ISIS can claim a caliphate back in Iraq and Syria and motivate fighters from all over the world to come join in protecting that caliphate. And that terrain in Iraq and Syria is vitally important to it and to its message. Right now, the campaigns in Iraq and Syria are going slowly and moving with difficulty. We have seen the remnants of the Iraqi security forces actually retake some terrain from ISIS, but certainly the retaking of that terrain has proceeded much more slowly than would be needed to create the reality that ISIS doesn't have a caliphate. ISIS is still in control of Mosul. We can be looking at each of a loss of a city here, and a loss of a city there. But ISIS is, in fact, able to defend a swath of territory between the Euphrates and the Tigris. That's pretty darn big. So what do we do? The issue that we have is that we do need to accelerate the campaign for retaking territory in order to deprive ISIS of its physical basing, its ability to launch attacks abroad, its ability actually to have a huge foreign fighter network that it can turn outward against the world. But we also need to retake that terrain in order to disrupt its message and its messaging and its resonance. So I don't know that a special expeditionary force itself will be sufficient to create the kind of disruption in ISIS as a network that we need to see, nor do I think that it will be fast enough to retake terrain. Nevertheless, I think it's an important next step to realize that we better speed this up. I mean, there are children in Mosul who are growing up under ISIS rule. We have an organization that is gaining strength and that is able to project not only its messages, but its capabilities to places like Sinai and Libya. And so there is an urgency about recovering that terrain in Iraq, and frankly also about recovering terrain in Syria. And things that we can do to speed that up are very important.
So, Kim, I do want to ask you, as we talk about accelerating the campaign on the ground against ISIS, the question people rightly are asking is accelerating it toward what goal?
Yeah.
And Bob Kagan, another famous member of this family, wrote a week ago in the Wall Street Journal a very powerful article in which he said, if you're talking about defeating this group, rooting it out of Raqqa and Ramadi and Fallujah and Mosul, you need to be thinking about a U.S. ground force on the order of 40 to 50,000 people. The highest you hear from even the more forward-leaning Republican candidates tends to be on the order of 10,000. And I want to ask you, as somebody who's thought deeply about this, whether you have a similar view that we need to begin to get our minds around the idea that a force that large of U.S. personnel may be necessary. What do you think?
We at ISW have been engaged in a planning exercise on this subject over the course of the past few weeks in order to ask that very, very question. And I have to say it's been really quite sobering to recognize the problem, the magnitude of the problem, particularly in Syria. In Syria, we actually face two mortal adversaries. We face not only ISIS, we face an al-Qaeda franchise that is deeply entrenched and effective, Jabhat al-Nusra. And sadly, there are actually quite a lot of scenarios that one can develop in which one diminishes the ISIS problem inside of Syria and ends up with an al-Qaeda safe haven. I would say that that's bad for U.S. national security and for global security. So we actually have to wrap our minds around the fact that the problem in Syria is so multifaceted that simply getting ISIS out of Raqqa is not going to render the world safe. Does that mean 40 or 50,000 troops? I certainly think that order of magnitude is much, much more realistic than 50 special forces folks working on targeting. We actually have to look at retaking ground. And if we're looking at retaking ground in that environment, the requirements are really, sadly, very, very high, and the risks to our national security, I think, justify considering whether it is worthwhile to put in a force of that size.
We'll perhaps return to this in a second round or in your questions, but I just should note that implicit in your answer is your analysis. It sounds to me that the proxy forces that we are hoping to work through, on which the president's strategy appears to be premised, are not realistically an option for clearing and holding this territory. But as I say, we'll return to that. I want to turn now to Graeme Wood. Graeme, part of what made your Atlantic piece so riveting was the way in which you evoked the meaning of this caliphate, this state, for the young people who have flocked to it physically and also online, the passion that they feel. And I want to ask you why that passion for the state and building the state, which you expressed to a group of us last summer as their absolute preoccupation, appears to be turning now toward external operations increasingly. Paris was dramatic evidence of that. Beirut was dramatic evidence of that. Mali, a whole series of operations. And I want to ask you whether it's the pressure that we've put on the state that's now pushing them outwards towards attacks in Europe and if they can, the United States, or whether that love for building the state will still remain their focus.
So it might help to talk a bit about the writing of that article, and I'm working on a book right now on the same topic, and because it's relevant to much of what has been said by Jared already about the digital aspects of this, because that's really where I started. Like a lot of analysts of ISIS, I went straight to their Twitter accounts, I went straight to their Facebook accounts, and really just cultivated this little, a normal person might have a sourdough culture or an ant farm at home, and I would have a list of Twitter accounts that I would as soon as they were zapped by Twitter, I'd add a new one and I'd find who they were following and so on. And so in some ways what Jared has just described is my nightmare, that it would be very difficult for me to do some of my work if you're successful. So I joined ISIS and partially hoping that you're
I think everybody wants to put you out of a job, Graeme.
So, but to get to the question of this turn toward external affairs, I was using Telegram, which ISIS had turned into a fountain of propaganda. It went from a chore of hours per day to find all these Twitter accounts to just looking at Telegram, a non-US service that they had official channels on. And I was very eager to see how they portrayed these external operations because, to be quite honest, having read their arguments, especially with Al-Qaeda, before, it was clear that ISIS's view of the world was that these spectacular attacks on the West were a bad idea. And they were actually trying to argue to Al-Qaeda that Al-Qaeda's having done these 9/11 attacks, Madrid, that these, while great for a few days, what did they get, Al-Qaeda? What was the final gain? It was actually the loss of their sanctuaries, a loss of their territories. And as ISIS, they would say, we have something that we don't want to lose. And therefore, these attacks are a bad idea. And clearly, they don't entirely think that anymore. The way that they avowed these attacks, it was, and has become more so, absolutely unequivocal. Just a few days ago, they had one of their most impressive video releases, huge amounts of work having gone into digital effects and so on, in which they clearly say, yes, we did it, we're proud of it, and they use these exact words in English: bring it on. We are ready to withstand the invasion that we've been telling Al-Qaeda for all this time that Al-Qaeda didn't fully take into account when it had its September 11 attack. So looking at that on Telegram, though, I was very interested to see the tone that the claim or endorsement of these attacks took. And this is true both of the Russian airliner that went down and of the Paris attack. There were distinct differences between the way that they were claimed and the way that ISIS has claimed previous attacks. specifically the way they were written. The claim of credit in French was actually riddled with grammatical errors, spelling errors. Even in Arabic, it was not nearly as florid, as smooth, or as even grammatically polished as it usually is. So I think one explanation of this turn is that it was perhaps not directly ordered by the central command of ISIS. That is, ISIS may have simply said to some of its agents, you go do what you're going to do, and they weren't, at least their PR agency, was not exactly ready for it to happen when it did, or how it did, or with the details that it eventually had. Another possibility, of course, and this is something that we actually do have to take seriously as a possibility, given the explicitness of their avowal and endorsement of the attacks since, is that they wanted them to happen, and they did so because they feel ready for an invasion. That is, they have a real optimism about how that would play out. I don't think that that's an optimism that's well placed if there really is a full-scale invasion by a NATO partnership. But that is the way that they have, from the start, portrayed their view of a foreign invasion as something that they would win. And given that they're continuing to push that line, even as an invasion is a more plausible thing as they publicly turn toward external attacks, I guess we have to take that possibility.
Ask Kim to interject here. Is their optimism well-founded? They seem to get rolled pretty well in Sinjar, although they built extensive tunnels and other preparations. They lost the Battle of Kobani at enormous cost. As this goes forward, how tough a fight will this be, Kim?
Well, I agree with Graeme that their optimism for a direct conflict with the United States and its NATO allies is ill-placed, that they would not succeed in that environment. But I actually think that it's really important to recognize that ISIS is using its sanctuaries in places such as Sinai and Libya and its franchises out in those areas as a way of creating strategic and operational resilience inside of Iraq and Syria. And I have here with me tonight Harleen Gambier, the ISIS analyst at the Institute. She's absolutely phenomenal, and she taught me everything I know about this. But she describes ISIS as operating in three rings. A ring inside of Iraq and Syria, that's core caliphate lands. A ring around that, metaphorically, that is in what she calls the near abroad, the former caliphate lands, historical lands, and then the far abroad. And the point simply is that as ISIS took those losses in Kobani or other places, it's made up for them in two ways: by looking strong through the establishment of franchises and through the resonance of its messaging and its ability to get it out there, but also by actually being strong and finding different places to recruit people from and train them in. So as long as the US actually remains reluctant to engage at a level of conflict that will be decisive, then ISIS can say things like bring it and actually get the results that they want, namely more and more mobilization in the world as a whole.
Let me turn back to Graeme for one question and then return to Jared. So let's assume for the moment that it is possible to mount a powerful, sustained campaign on the ground that, in the president's words, degrades and destroys ISIS in its strongholds in Iraq and Syria. So, but this capability for external operations and this diverse network around the Muslim world continues to exist. Graeme, as you read the messaging, what would be the reaction of young Muslims as they saw this dream of the state being rolled up, would the group lose its romantic appeal? Would people get enraged at the defeat of this state? And what's your sense of that, reading what people say online?
When ISIS claimed credit for the Paris attack, its next statement, the next thing that it put out, was a photo essay about washers and dryers in the city of Raqqa. It was trying to show that if you immigrate here, you'll have clean clothes, you'll have roughly the same appliances that you'd have at home. So I think that a lot of people who receive these messages would immediately see that if ISIS actually loses Raqqa, if it actually loses its territory, that ISIS would simply look ridiculous in many of the things that it had claimed for itself. One of the core aspects of this narrative is that ISIS is winning, that it's successful, that on the ground it is expanding, that it's not getting rolled back. And so I actually think that there's one other reading of this turn toward external operations, which is that ISIS sees that it's not forever going to be able to have such a nice home appliance store in Raqqa, and that there will be a kind of act of what Jim Jones called revolutionary suicide, as the core aspects of that dream are demolished. That could be, in the short term, very bad. I mean, that would mean, as we've actually seen recently, an uptick in suicide bombing as a tactic, and possibly also a kind of going out with a bang on Western soil, too.
Jared, you are a technologist. You're working for arguably our country's most famous technology company. And so I want to ask you about two technical aspects of the fight that you described, the digital counterinsurgency. The first is what you describe as the application of machine learning, essentially countering their non-human digital army with the West's non-human digital army, which would be powerful and pervasive. I have a little bit the anxiety I used to have when I watched The Sorcerer's Apprentice in Fantasia. That sort of, you start off thinking you know what you're doing with these machines, and then suddenly the buckets are flying. So that first, talk to us about the application of machine learning, and second, it is now said increasingly by members of the administration. FBI Director Comey has been the most outspoken, that in dealing with this adversary, in your sense of digital counterinsurgency, I guess in particular, we have a problem of going dark. We can't see them. They are too good at hiding themselves and their messages, and that this is absent changes by technology companies around the world. Too much of what they do will be invisible to us. And I know this a whole audience would be grateful for your assessment of whether that's true and what you think about what should be done about it. So those two questions.
Absolutely, yeah. No, if it's okay, I'll take the second one first. So when I talk about how we need to focus not on contain or defeat ISIS online, but focus on a more pragmatic objective of marginalizing them, what I mean is the following, which is, we're used to terrorist groups and criminal organizations operating in the dark web. The dark web, by virtue of what it is very difficult to sort of counter. There's lots of law enforcement means that are sort of thrown at it, but it's a difficult space. Where ISIS is unique or unusual is their robust presence not just in the dark web, but also in the open web. It by no means solves the digital problem of ISIS by pushing them back into the dark web and keeping them there, right? Obviously, there's still the ability that they have in the dark web to secretly coordinate attacks that are very difficult to detect and so forth. But by being in the open web, it also means that they can recruit some random person in Oregon who doesn't know a single person in Iraq and Syria. We know a lot of the people who are going over to fight have a personal connection to somebody there. But what we also know is because of their robust presence online, there's a lot of people trying to go over there that actually don't know someone there. Now, fortunately, a lot of those people aren't the smartest characters that we've seen around, and so many of them are getting caught before getting there, but some of them are not. And of course, we all have the concern that instead of bothering to go to Iraq and Syria, which is much more difficult, they're going to turn their attention back home. So that's sort of really what I mean about marginalization. The other point that I'll make on this, and I'll get to the machine learning piece, which is at the beginning.
I think do speak to the question that Comey raises, which is absent changes that are feasible technically. We're just not going to know enough to conduct this battle, because I didn't hear an answer to that in what you said.
Yeah, I mean, if you're talking about encryption and things of that, I mean, look, it's a tricky thing because there's a lot of emphasis that you're hearing a lot of people right now talking about how the challenge with encryption is it's making things more difficult for law enforcement. If you actually look at the numbers and if you actually look at the percentages of instances where law enforcement claims they weren't able to find something because it was encrypted, it's actually a very low percentage. The other aspect of this is, whenever you're talking about encryption, you have to look at it holistically, right? There's, the dissident issue, there's your banking, there's, privacy issues and so forth. And, obviously terrorism's on everybody's mind right now. And believe me, it's certainly, anyone who thinks isn't on the mind of companies is incredibly mistaken. And I think, people, should understand that companies actually work really hard when a subpoena is, specific and very clear. Companies respond to them, in as expedient a fashion as you would hope. Where you have problems is when people start talking about backdoors, right? Companies have worked really hard to make sure that there are legal mechanisms by which law enforcement can come in through the front door, and our responsibility is to respond to that very clearly. But when these subpoena requests are really broad, not specific, incredibly general, it's very difficult to respond to those because you have a lot of other factors to consider.
That's a helpful answer, I think, for all of us. Do address the machine learning part of this.
So, whenever you're dealing with any challenge, when I was in government, I used to I concluded by the end of my time in government that foreign policy and statecraft and all these things, they're just sort of fancy ways of saying troubleshooting, right? You're always sort of troubleshooting some problem. So if you're troubleshooting any problem, you want the best technology and tools at your disposal. And by the way, our adversaries are using the best tools that they have at their disposal, and oftentimes they're the ones that get it first. So I always think it's interesting to ask the question, what's new technologically? What's the new technological insight that may be something that we can leverage in addressing this? People talk a lot about AI, which is a very broad field, and it sort of gets misconstrued as all the science fiction stuff. But there's more sort of aspects of AI that are grounded in reality, machine learning being a quintessential example of this. And machine learning itself is very broad, right? So anyone who's searched online and seen ads that look like search returns, you've sort of experienced machine learning, and hopefully it's helped you, and you've clicked on some of them. But that's more of a classification machine learning model where there's a data set and a set of categories, and the machine is very good at taking all of the words and phrases and putting them into every imaginable combination, right? So the machine ends up, it's very useful for things like online advertisement. But what's really new and the new insight is we've all been sort of familiar with the big data concept. What's new is the ability to process all that data through multiple machines as opposed to through a single machine. And this, what this has made is a whole bunch of new things possible. The most interesting one for the context of this conversation is something called natural language learning, where we can look at we can actually begin to pick up on tone of language by looking at variations between one type of abuse and another type of abuse. And I can't say with certainty, but we really are excited about the potential this has to scale the ability to moderate platforms and enforce codes of conduct. So in the physical domain, the world that Kim works a lot in, the conversation centers around how do you empower the tribal leaders and how do you empower the local sheikhs to be able to assert their control over a territory and take back governance. Online, you have the same problem, except instead of tribal leaders and sheikhs, you have moderators. And no matter what publisher and platform you're talking about on the internet, if there's any sort of meaningful traffic, every moderator has the same problem, which is it is almost impossible to have human beings fully moderate a platform in accordance with a code of conduct. And add trolls into the mix, proliferations of fake accounts into the mix, and it just gets very, very difficult. So the question technologically that we're asking ourselves is, with the new developments in machine learning and the potential that natural language learning offers, is there a way that we might be able to algorithmically scale the moderation process. We don't have a good answer for this yet, but there's a lot of engineers that are quite excited about this. And one of the things that I've observed moving from government to the private sector is you actually get a great situation in the private sector, because when you're dealing with engineers, you get some that want to work on this because they're really inspired by the fact that they might be able to do something to make a dent in this challenge. And then you get some that haven't thought about the challenge at all, and they're completely excited about the technology. Now, the good news for us is the most compelling technological insights around machine learning happen to also be the most cutting-edge technology that the smartest engineers want to work on. So the interests are aligned, and I think it's really about asking some of these questions. That's one example of a new technological insight that could have a meaningful impact, but there's a lot of others out there as well. And I'll give you a sort of concrete example of also sort of what this looks like even in the old model of machine learning. And I sort of admonished counter-narratives at the beginning as a panacea to the problem, but it doesn't mean I don't think we should try it. I just think it's sort of one of many sort of components of a larger comprehensive strategy. But we did a sort of pilot project called Abdullah X, where it was a partnership between Google, NGO that organizes former violent extremists, and a number of others. And the former violent extremists developed a series of short cartoons basically making fun of people for going to Syria and essentially calling them lame in a way that they deemed culturally appropriate and so forth. And a series of search queries were identified that they believed ISIS aspirants in the UK were searching for to try to figure out how to get to Syria and Iraq. And the pilot campaign teed up the former's cartoons as ads against those search queries. So what this means is instead of getting 10 million random views of Justin Bieber followers or whatever, you ended up getting 50,000 people who were specifically searching for these things. Now the problem with that and the limits of that is it's you don't know, or is it a bunch of Graemes, or is it a bunch of people who are actually trying to get there? So again, metrics are really difficult. So you have metrics on how many people were searching for how do I go wage jihad in Syria. You have metrics on how many of them then went and clicked on an ad. You have metrics for how long they stayed on an ad. But again, you don't have metrics for what happened next. So the conclusion you come to is there is no silver bullet answer to this, right? The sort of answer to how you deal with this problem on the digital front is you need to try a lot of small things instead of sort of one big thing that's sort of really expensive and you've invested so much in that you can't adapt. And this is how the tech sector works, right? We sort of launch something, we iterate on it. If it's not working, we sunset it and celebrate failure and sort of learn from it and figure out something different.
If you want to have some fun when you get home, if you're not too tired, type into your search box on YouTube or whatever, Abdullah X, and you will find these really clever things that were put together with the help of Jared's organization. What's striking about them is they say to young people, do you think that doing this, going to Syria, do you think this is what Islam is about? Get real. And it's very much in your face, very much in a language that these are, I think, were originally made in Britain, but it's fun just to look at them. So Kim, I want to ask you to talk about the battle space, both digital, if you want to get into that, but physical, as we've been talking earlier. And please not limit it to Iraq and Syria, because this is becoming a global confrontation. The ability of ISIS to put down roots in so many places in the Muslim world, it has really been striking. And so I want to ask you what your thinking is about how the coalition that's fighting ISIS should think about this battle space and deal with the reality that in Pakistan, Indonesia, Malaysia, Mali, go down the list, there are simultaneous problems. I was yesterday with a leader from Southeast Asia who made the point that if you take just 0.1% of the Muslim population, let's go on the low end and say these people are not going to have much appeal. That is so many people if you're looking at the Indonesias, Malaysias, Nigerias of the world. So talk about the battle space in the broader sense.
It's a terrific question, and it is a very fundamental question, because I think we are at a point in which ISIS has some capability, is on the crux of a change. Right now, its foundation is in Iraq and Syria, and it needs the physical terrain in Iraq and Syria. The apparatus that it has developed in Iraq and Syria is really quite sophisticated when you think about it. I think a lot of us imagine that it's easy to be a terrorist and blow things up. And it actually turns out to be really hard to be a terrorist and blow the right things up well. And thank goodness, it helps me sleep at night just a little bit, and maybe you can sleep a little bit better too, knowing that. But the actual infrastructure that is required to have a global mobilization of the variety that ISIS now has is actually fairly substantial. The amount of infrastructure that they have to get people into and out of Iraq and Syria, to create the kinds of explosives that they have, to command and control forces, to move people and goods from place to place, that's a pretty big infrastructure. And so the good news for now is that Iraq and Syria in the physical terrain continue to be highly relevant and important for ISIS's battles out in the near and far abroad. Without that base in Iraq and Syria, it could not now be successful in Bangladesh or in Afghanistan or even in North Africa. What I think we're at the risk of seeing is a transition. When ISIS establishes or actually accepts the allegiance of its governorates abroad, it actually makes a strategic decision to do so. You know, is this an organization with which we, ISIS, want to affiliate? What do we gain by it? And what will we have to put into it? And then, rather frighteningly, they actually make investments in these different organizations. So we have seen them invest in the organization in Sinai. We have seen them invest in the organization in Libya. They have transferred very specific signature capabilities that they developed in and around Mosul to both of those areas, so that we could watch a campaign unfold in the Sinai this summer that had unique signatures from the Mosul area. That's how we know, as analysts, that a capability has shifted, that it's not just an idea or an organization, but some relationship between the center and the periphery. The problem that I think we have, particularly in Libya, also in Sinai and elsewhere, is that these organizations at a certain point have enough capability actually to continue to project forward. And so I think this is actually a vital moment in time for defining what ISIS will be and where its tendrils will be over time. We need to make sure that our strategy for Iraq and Syria moves faster, but we actually now need to address the fact that ISIS has capable affiliates in Sinai and Libya and is sending funding to Afghanistan, and that it has the capacity to use these networks to continue to regenerate both the idea of the caliphate, but also the foreign fighter networks and the movement of goods throughout the global jihad. So that's why I think we're at such a pivotal moment in time, and it's why I think the Paris attacks in particular have so much resonance, not just for the public, but for those of us who analyze ISIS.
Jared.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback on what Kim's saying, because when you hear her describe this, I mean, it's sort of a corporation model, right? What ISIS is busy doing is going out and doing acquisitions, right? And the acquisitions are motivated by different things. So some acquisitions are to gain terrorist market share in Nigeria. Some are to gain maybe access to a particular criminal network that's important for a supplemental revenue stream. There's sort of, again, different motivations. And even when Kim talks about, the resources that, ISIS's core has invested in by virtue of being acquired into ISIS, they then get the benefit of ISIS's sort of proprietary products. Now, where I think this gets interesting is we've thought about ISIS and the acquisition model really in the sort of physical domain. And I said at the beginning that ISIS right now, there's not a lot of evidence that it possesses a capacity to conduct, sort of meaningful cyber attacks. It's really just recruitment and propaganda. But the question you have to ask yourself is, do they have the money to go out and just acquire the capabilities, right? Last time I checked, the types of criminal hacker networks that are out there, they're not like the most savory characters, right? These are not people who really sort of spend a lot of time thinking about right and wrong. They're just much more mercenary in their mentality, and they'll sell to the highest bidder. But let's give the criminal networks the benefit of the doubt and say that they have some values, and ISIS is where they draw the line. Okay, well, it's not that difficult for a criminal network, or it's not that difficult for a group like ISIS to recognize this and basically obfuscate their identity and pose as something else and acquire the capabilities. And I doubt the criminal hackers are spending a lot of time doing multiple layers of vetting. And so I think this is my concern, is it's much less expensive to go out and buy the cyber capability that one would need to sort of conduct nefarious attacks than it is certainly to go out and try to acquire a nuclear weapon or a ballistic missile or something of that nature. And I'm sort of fearful that we're going to wake up one day and they will have gone out and acquired this capability. So then the question is, what would they do with it and what capability would they seek out?
So, Graeme, I want to ask you a question, and then I want to turn after that to the audience, so please be thinking of your questions. Graeme, as you look at this group and study its theology, its ambitions, its intellectual, ideological roots, what do you see as the likelihood that it will turn its attention more decisively towards Saudi Arabia? A caliphate that has Mosul, Ramadi, Fallujah, Raqqa is one thing. A caliphate that has Mecca and Medina is quite another. And if you could speak, first, to what extent do you think they have that ambition in their deep down? And second, as you look at online messaging, people who follow this carefully say you'd be really troubled if you read all of the Twitter feed from Saudi Arabia expressing support for this group. So, what about the Saudi front, especially as let's imagine we do roll into Raqqa. Wouldn't that group naturally, move south across the desert toward a different and in some ways much more dangerous front?
So I think that we might best consider this not as a matter of it moving south across the desert, but already being in Saudi Arabia. When we talk about an acquisition model for ISIS's expansion, there's also a kind of pre-acquisition model that they have, which is what we see right now in the series of attacks especially on Shia in Saudi Arabia. This is really old school Zarqawi methods of gaining power. It's sowing chaos by creating sectarianism, civil war, and that I think is probably the way that they consider Saudi Arabia as being on their wish list. They are actively trying to create an atmosphere of chaos. And once they have that, they can then show what they've done in Raqqa, what they've done in Mosul, as an alternative to the terrible conditions that would then obtain after you saw Saudi Arabia turn into a state of war and chaos. So I don't think they have any realistic ambition of actually getting Saudi Arabia through conquest. I don't think that's what they think will happen. I think what they expect to happen is by having this preparing of ground, that Saudi Arabia would be ready. It would, as you say, if you read the social media out of Saudi Arabia, you find worrying things not just on the part of ISIS supporters, but on the part of non-ISIS supporters. ISIS opponents will often say things that would trouble you deeply about, say, the Shia of Saudi Arabia. They will absolutely capitalize on that. And yes, there's also no question that in their certainly in the ways that they expect to fulfill this prophetic vision and this apocalyptic vision, they expect Saudi Arabia eventually to fall to them because it has to.
Say one word before we turn to the audience about the apocalyptic theme in ISIS's ideology, this end of days idea that seems to be part of its appeal. Often we think groups like that burn themselves out. We think of the kind of group suicide, Jim Jones in the jungle moment. What do you think about that end of days theme and how it will play out over time with the digital audience?
It is a relentless theme, especially in the official channels. I mentioned the video production that they just put out. It ends after this bring it on message with the word Dabik, which is the name both of their propaganda magazine and of the city in Syria where they expect the confrontation with the Crusaders to happen. They say, bring it on and we will meet you in Dabik. When they announced that they had brought down the Russian airliner, they said, it'll take you some time to analyze the black box, but don't worry, we're waiting for you in the Amek Valley, which is another site of this apocalyptic vision. I've spent a lot of time wondering how much of this is rhetoric, how much of it is something serious. And you know, in addition to watching social media and seeing how it's used as anonymous rhetoric, whenever I meet someone who is a supporter of the Islamic State, I first wait to find out if this is something that he or she brings up. And I would say at least half the time it is. And then the other half, when I bring it up, it's something that supporter is certainly well versed in and usually also enthusiastic about. So I think the ideological penetration of that part of the narrative is quite high. It should be mentioned though that you know, if you give a roadmap for what you see as your future, and it includes particular towns in Syria, it includes particular successes, then you're just asking to be falsified. They believe that the caliphates will not be extinguished until the return of Jesus in Jerusalem, and all of that will happen only once the Antichrist has appeared and gone to every part of planet Earth. So if a caliphate is extinguished before that, they have to look back at their narrative and do some explaining. It's religion, of course, so it's open to all sorts of interpretation, and maybe you can find a way to explain why it didn't happen the way you said it was going to happen. Prophecy fails and believers persist. Then again, these are some very specific prophecies.
Powerful stuff. Let's go to the audience. Please, in the normal council way, identify yourselves, keep your questions short. Please, if you have a particular member of the panel to whom you'd like to direct the question, do so. So, yes, please.
Dana Connors, I'm with the Electronic Data Methods Forum at Academy Health. This might be a question for Kim, but maybe Graeme. Based on this conversation and the idea of expanding these triple spheres, what is the reach, I guess, or what is the reach that ISIS sees itself having? At what point does its second or near abroad become its far abroad, or the far abroad maybe be encompassed by the near abroad in the concept of their 5-year plan or their 10-year plan? Yeah. What is their concept of where they will be in 5 years?
Kim, you want to begin that, and then Graeme, if you have thoughts?
I can try, but I actually think that the realization of this concept may lie in what Graeme has discussed already in two different ways. One, in the fact that, of course, the end state of apocalyptic vision is not necessarily met fully in the seizing and holding of terrain. So we'll see if they can actually do that, and we'll see if they do that if they get there. But I think it's very important to remember that there is a concept that they have in the physical world and a religious and ideological concept. They overlay, but they are not actually necessarily fully synchronized. That said, what we see ISIS doing is actually really smart. It has a strategy that it pursues when it encounters strong states, such as Saudi Arabia, or even Iraq in 2012 was not weak in the manner of the vacuum that is Libya or Yemen. And so ISIS has a way of breaking down strong states while expanding to fill vacuums that already exist. In some ways, they're opportunistic about which vacuums they choose and which strong states they choose. But I actually think that they are thinking about the Middle East in a very strategic way. Unlike Al-Qaeda, in some ways, ISIS thinks in international relations terms that we would all be very comfortable talking about here at the Council. It thinks about ways of bringing states against other states to create that kind of chaos. It thinks about the way of causing enough friction between Israel and Egypt actually to ignite a conflict. It thinks about ways of creating enough instability in Lebanon at the same time to ignite a conflict. It thinks about ways of undermining Jordan or collapsing the regime in Saudi Arabia. These are very international relations-y ideas of how to bring about a regional situation that is ripe for physical expansion and that might also help carry the apocalyptic narrative forward.
Graeme, do you want to add to that?
I would just say that the apocalyptic narrative is not entirely limited in the geography that it claims. You find some ISIS supporters who believe that ISIS will, over the course of a few decades, or maybe perhaps less, cover the entire earth. You find others who say that, no, actually, it'll get as far as Rome, and that will fulfill all of this. But I think Kim is exactly right, the way that she describes especially the Arab world strategy as being one of finding targets that it can degrade in many different ways, both military and ideological, and then using those as springboards moving forward. I think the ones that it's probably looking at with most eagerness are, I would guess, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan.
Yes, please.
Cynthia Schneider, Georgetown University. I wanted to turn the discussion to Mali, and I don't know if this was intended by the attackers, but Mali in the present, and certainly its illustrious past, is the kind of the authentic counter-narrative to everything that ISIS stands for. I don't know if that's only panacea, so I want to hear what you think about this, Jared. But a project that I'm working on, the Timbuktu Renaissance, is actually working with your partner, Google Cultural Institute, to translate and present on the web the content of the Timbuktu manuscripts, which come from the great age of Islamic learning. Is there a role for this kind of authentic counter-narrative, and not to replace the lame humor ideas, which I think are fantastic, but a kind of tangible presentation of Islamic culture and learning that is the opposite of what these people say it is?
Jared?
Yeah, it's good to see you, Cynthia. I think part of the problem is we can't. Not every member of ISIS has the same command and sophistication in talking about the ideology. So there's one. I think we would be sort of incorrect to assume that every kid on the battlefield firing an RPG or laying a roadside bomb is like well versed in the sort of deep sophistication of all the ideology. I think my hypothesis is that as you move to some of the Western fronts, Europe, the United States, and elsewhere, people have a greater luxury to be able to spend the time and have even the background to be able to develop that level of sophistication, which makes them very dangerous from a recruitment perspective, makes them very dangerous from a homegrown perspective. With regards to Mali specifically, I've been to Timbuktu, very strange side story. I had a brief obsession when I was in college with finding the different Jewish communities in sub-Saharan Africa, and I did my sophomore spring break with a friend to go try to find the Timbuktu Jews, and didn't do my research, got there and found out I'd missed them by about 170 years. But that's an aside. I think the Western Sahel is tricky because it's the sort of one exception to my sort of dogmatic point at the beginning, which is every terrorist group going forward is going to operate on both the physical domain and the digital domain. The Western Sahel will get there eventually, but they're probably going to be last to arrive.
Yes, in the fourth row. Yes, please. Hold on, and we'll get you a microphone.
Thanks. Judith Plunkett. I'm a freelance writer. It's probably for Kimberly, perhaps Graeme as well. In looking at the battlefield, as it is, we often talk about Iraq, Syria. Really, the people we're standing up these days, though, and who are doing the best of the fighting are the Peshmerga. And I'm wondering, because it's impossible to not see the battlefield as partly Turkey, because how long can we expect the Peshmerga and the Kurds to keep fighting if there is nothing in this for them? If once again they are going to be done out of any kind of an independent area, whether it's a part of Syria, Iraq, Turkey.
Well, the Peshmerga have made some important gains that I think they're probably very excited about in northern Iraq and Kirkuk and elsewhere. But I think it's really important not to see any one force as the panacea here, whether it's mythical or digital or actually real. The Peshmerga are effective. These are the Kurdish fighters. They are effective in Kurdish areas near Kurdish terrain. And they're very effective at holding Kurdish areas. And that is extremely important. It's incredible and an important service and has actually changed what ISIS can do, what it's able to control in Iraq. The Peshmerga are not an expeditionary force. They are not projectable into, say, Ramadi, which is to their south in entirely Sunni Arab lands. They are not projectable everywhere on the battlefield. And so we have to recognize the real limitations and what they're actually great at. Great, they can do what they're not great at. We shouldn't ask them to do, nor would it be good for them to do this. And this gets back to David's question from earlier on. One of the problems that we have relying on a variety of local forces to take pieces and retake pieces of the battlefield is that they bring with them local grievances and local objectives. The Kurds and Arabs of northern Iraq have not always been friends. And in fact, there was a degree of Kurdish, faults on both sides here. But the Kurds were actually in the process of taking some Arab territory and flying their flags back in 2009 in something that almost came to an actual military conflict. We can find ourselves in both Iraq and Syria relying on local proxy forces to take care of the ISIS problem and just leave tendrils for follow-on ethnic conflict between Arabs and Kurds or follow-on religious and sectarian conflict. So the risk that we run by hyper-empowering proxy forces outside of the areas in which they're really native is very, very high risk. And it's one of the reasons why we have to consider what kinds of things we need to do with our forces to meet our objectives, while also thinking about how to leverage the great partners that we have that are out there.
Kevin.
Kevin Sullivan from the Washington Post. What should be our 50-year plan with these people? I mean, you can send in 100,000 people, you can wipe out this current franchise that we call ISIS, you can kill Baghdadi, you can take back Raqqa, but that does nothing to defeat the ideology, this dream of the caliphate, any more than blowing up every Walmart in America defeats the idea of capitalism. What's the long-term goal? Do we just have to learn to live with this kind of simmering rage around the world, no matter what we do with the current incarnation of it?
Graeme, you've studied this. Do you want to speak to that, and Jared perhaps also?
I certainly don't know what things will look like in 50 years, but I do think that it's important to see the attraction of the ideology as something that's partially generational. And in 50 years, a generation does pass. You know, when you look at the way that people accept this ideology, it's partially that they see it as a rejection of certainly their parents' generation, but also their parents' generation of jihadists. So maybe the next generation will decide that their parents, the ones who have not blown themselves up, that they also had a pretty square way of looking at the world and will choose something else. Let's hope it's something less destructive than a caliphate, like meth or something.
Graeme, could I, just to ask you the question that I have been turning over in my mind for more than 30 years. Do you see this story ending with the Muslim world, the Muslim diaspora included, becoming fully modern, embracing the modern world of the United States and Europe comfortably? Is that where this story is going? Leave aside how long it takes and how bumpy it is, or is that an unrealistic idea?
Well, that's a world historical question, I think, but it's something that, you know, when we look at the ways that ISIS confronts the Shia in particular, this is it's phrased as a fight between aspects of Islam, and these are questions that they are, you know, they're part of a sectarian difference within a huge tradition of a couple billion people. So I think that to hope that they are resolved in a way that pushes them out of the battlefield space or pushes them out of the space of politics is to hope that a transformation happens that's far beyond my capacity to predict. I still think of it as something that's as grand a problem and will require as grand a solution as, say, the wars of religion in Europe, which of course took decades and killed millions of people. So there's pessimism for you.
In the second row, yes, please, and then.
Thank you. I'm Polly Nayak. I'm an independent consultant who's been working on South Asia in particular for many years and a lot of the same issues. And I wanted to pick up on Kimberly Kagan's comments about the danger for us of having proxies who are at the limits of what they can do and who have their own agendas. Is that not equally true of ISIS? As ISIS expands and picks up people who are attracted to ISIS for reasons having to do with local context rather than universal appeals. In fact, is that not true of any movement that attempts to go out of its initial comfort zone? I also just wanted to add one very quick comment since I've got the microphone. And that is, if we'd been talking about terrorism in the 80s, we would have been talking about Shia terrorism. You know, I mean, think what a short time that really represents in terms of global history.
Well, I think that you've put your finger on one of a number of vulnerabilities that ISIS has as an organization. And I think we have to recognize that although it has some critical capabilities that make it particularly effective as an organization, its ability to hold terrain, its ability to institute governance, its ability to claim authority as a caliphate, its ability actually to communicate this unitary message. It also has vulnerabilities. It is not a faultless organization. So its inability to integrate or be able to rely on these new franchises may well be one of them. And I wish ISIS luck managing Boko Haram. I don't actually think that that was an acquisition that they are perhaps as excited about owning as some of the other franchises out there in the world. And in fact, they've differentiated in their messaging about Boko compared to other organizations. But they have other vulnerabilities as well. Their inability actually to maintain functioning governance, let alone the washers and dryers and kebab stands that they promise, will over time be a problem for them. The question, they also will have a problem controlling all of their followers. They are actually quite rigid in enforcing discipline within an organization. As they grow, they're going to have a challenge making sure that that discipline is enforced throughout their franchises. So those are vulnerabilities that we can exploit. It's just that we need to exploit them in time. ISIS has a generational strategy. It does talk about the conquest of Rome. It talks about mobilizing and radicalizing the Muslim populations of Europe by getting a political discourse going that actually results in the identification of Muslim communities with ISIS. It is educating young people right now in its centers throughout its lands in an environment where those kids don't know anything other than the caliphate. That's a danger. And it's one of the senses of urgency that I have, and one of the reasons why I think we need to recognize this is a very important moment in time.
So I want to collect, in the interests of getting as many questions as we can, collect a few, and I'll try to go to the back room. First you, sir, on the side, and then all the way in the back, I see two hands, and we'll come up here to a couple people.
Thank you very much. Flavius Mihes with the World Bank. First question to Jared. From your perch over at Google, have you observed any initiatives, best practices from folks online projects that you would recommend others to emulate? Some thought leaders that are fighting an efficient fight, a digital counterinsurgency fight. So specific examples. And perhaps more toward Graeme, the next question, since you study the ideology and the theology, which side do you take, if any, on the radical Islam label? Is it accurate to call it radical Islam, the Islamic State, or just jihadist? I mean, how would you help us explain, if you don't take sides of this? Thank you.
So all the way in the back, yes, all the way, so, yes, sir, and then the gentleman sitting with his back against the wall.
Thank you. Clint Watts, FPRI. Jared, I agree with you on your counter-narratives. It's a mirage in the desert. We'll never get there. It'll never be what we want. In the one-on-one intervention space, we always try and negotiate with people for a middle ground. And yet, in the online space, we sort of only offer two options. One, don't join ISIS, or don't do anything. And we know these people are motivated and mobilized. What about the alternative narrative in the online space? Have you guys experimented with that or looked at it? Things like the refugee issue, can we redirect people in the online communities? Ideas like that.
Yes, right behind you.
Daniel, better know the opposition. My question is, if we look at the websites of the Syrian opposition and rebel groups, about half of them are going to be down or really, really slow. And this could be because they're being DDoS'd or the ISPs or DNS providers have taken action. I'm just wondering what you think the implications are of this on some of these ultra-conservative rebel groups that are competing with ISIS for followers.
And let's come up to the front. You had your hand up, sir, and then David. This gentleman here in the third row, yes.
Fred Ruggiero, retired Air Force. Thank you for a great panel tonight. And there's been some comparing and contrasting, rightfully so, of al-Qaeda and ISIS. But one of the things that Al-Qaeda has taught us over the years is when they're going to do something, when they say they're going to do something, they typically do, or at least try many, many, many times. When ISIS says we're coming to Washington, D.C., do we believe them? Are they here? Is that digitally or is that physically? Thank you.
And David Dunn.
Hi, I'm David Dunn. I'm a lawyer who spent a fair amount of time advising some of these governments in the Gulf who are under challenge. And the thing that I always noticed was the elephant in the room whenever you're talking to leaders one-on-one or in small groups is the constant challenge to achieve political legitimacy when Islam is not your rule of law. You've chosen a secular path. And so my question is our physical entrance not conferring the legitimacy that is so sought by ISIS among the generation of young people who don't find that legitimacy among the leaders in the region?
With apologies to people who I have not been able to recognize, I'm going to turn back to the panel, and I'd ask each of you to respond to the questions or parts of questions that interest you most. I'll just summarize the interesting questions. Jared, in particular, was asked, what are best practices in the digital fight? And Graeme, what about the names that we give this? Should we be speaking about radical Islam, Islamic terrorism? Should we call it extremism? Does it make a difference? The question was asked about options in the digital space. Should we be opening up chances for people, if I understood the question, to deal with other things other than join or don't join the fight in Raqqa? The websites of the Syrian opposition groups, they are woefully less effective and powerful than those of ISIS. Al-Qaeda versus ISIS, do we believe it when they say they're coming here? Do they have the capability, or is that just talk? And then finally, the basic, are we creating enemies question? Are we conferring legitimacy in precisely the ways that our adversaries would most want by our actions? So let me start with Graeme, and then we'll end with Jared.
All right, so on the question of whether we call it radical Islam, I think clearly, yes, it is radical Islam. However, I would also point out that most of their enemies are also radical Islam, Al-Qaeda being one, and also quietists. Quietists in the Salafi strain are, by any standard, radical, even if they're not politically active. This is the official state religion of Saudi Arabia, and it is a very strong ideological argument, radical argument, Muslim argument against ISIS. So I think the label, it certainly doesn't mean that they're the only type of radical Islam, so I'd be cautious about using that carelessly. On the question of ISIS being capable of striking DC, they will certainly make use of all the rhetorical strategies that they can. They would list every major city on earth if there were time in their videos, and if it continued to be entertaining after the fourth or fifth one. So I'm not surprised that they've mentioned DC. It's not impossible that they would have the capability of striking America. All the ISIS supporters that I have looked at, communicated with from the United States, have been very eager to get out of the United States and go to Syria and Iraq. Are there some left behind? Maybe, I don't know. And then on the question of the physical entrance into the conflict of the United States, that would absolutely confer on ISIS, it would confirm its narrative in key ways. Maybe that is something that we're willing to risk if ISIS is, if we can stop ISIS from having attacks on American soil. At the moment, I think that narrative is something that we should probably resist confirming by being having as light a touch as possible in our military efforts against them.
Kim, and I'd especially be interested in how you would handle that last argument.
That last one. In some ways, ISIS has confirmed its own narrative by making real a physical caliphate that it has held now since June of 2014. And so I think we need to recognize that in the eyes of ISIS's followers, they're legitimate. So I don't know that we must consider their narrative as we take actions, but I do not think that we can let their narrative control our actions, because I actually think that their narrative is resonant and persistent without our actions. It's the terrible and horrible thing about what it is that ISIS has done. So in order actually to address ISIS as a problem, ISIS as a threat with actual capabilities to bring foreign fighters into Iraq and Syria to hold terrain, to create a resonant message, we actually have to take, with our allies, with our partners, yes, but we have to take that terrain back from Iraq and Syria, because the infrastructure that they require is there in Iraq and Syria. They can run threat nodes throughout Europe from Iraq and Syria. They can probably run threat nodes toward our shores from Iraq and Syria, although the distance is greater and the difficulty that they have will be higher. So if we don't want to live with a permanent terrorist safe haven instantiated, we actually have to, well, uninstantiate that safe haven. We actually have to take that terrain away. Is that sufficient? No. Is that important and vital and absolutely necessary? Yeah, because otherwise the message will continue to resonate. ISIS has changed the face of terrorism forever. You know, it's changed the nature of terrorism. We used to think of terrorists as, you know, a cell of bad guys that blew things up or hijacked airplanes. We can now see as a global community that terrorists can also have armies seize terrain and impose terror through governing in a way that I don't think we've ever seen before. And that idea is going to continue to resonate for generations.
So just taking these in no particular order on the sort of what else are we doing and looking at. Part of the reason I like the digital counterinsurgency framework is it implies that what we're really trying to do is understand the tactics that are causing the most harm online. And so today we're here talking about ISIS as a context, but the tactics that ISIS uses to proliferate fake accounts, to spread propaganda messages, to recruit, it's the same thing that spammers use who are trying to sell a product or just annoy you. It's the same thing that cyberbullies use, same thing that the Russian troll farms are using. A lot of the sort of things that we're seeing from these are all things that we've seen before in other contexts. So the good news about that is these are not unfamiliar tactics to the technology companies who have the sort of world's leading expertise on how to deal with them. And I think there's lots of instances on spam. There's been huge progress made in terms of dealing with that. There's some really sort of fun examples. LinkedIn did an experiment where they took all the spammers and they created a faked LinkedIn account that the spammers logged into, and they just all started spamming each other and didn't annoy the actual LinkedIn people. But I mention this only because I think that the dots have to be connected between the types of capabilities that companies are countering in other contexts and how those same learnings and best practices can be used in this context. And I think that there's a huge role for subject matter experts to play in really highlighting that connection. To Clint's excellent question, I think this really gets down to an incorrect way in which we've framed the sort of objective with regards to what we're trying to achieve, which is even this whole notion of winning hearts and minds, right? It would be a fantastic feat if we could achieve it. The likelihood of being able to cause somebody who wants to join ISIS to take a full pendulum swing to falling in love with American values, I'm not really that optimistic about it, although I would certainly welcome it. I guess my sort of pragmatic view is I don't really care if they like us or hate us. I care if their hatred of us and day-to-day grievances manifest themselves in the form of violent extremism. And what that means is the objective is not winning hearts and minds. The objective is how do we divert the sort of most at-risk characters away from the recruitment process. And that alternative may be something that we actually don't like, but it's not violent. So I think that pragmatically we need to start looking at what some of those options are. So I agree with you. On the refugee issue, it's not a technology answer, and it gets to the 50-year question. There's a lot of refugees that aren't in school right now. There's no clear evidence that they're going to be in school anytime in the near future, and you talk to the major relief organizations and the money's not there. I would hypothesize that a kid who gets back to school now as opposed to never getting back to school is probably a better sort of contributor to society in a world where we don't like ISIS than one that never went to school. And I think it is worth somebody asking, what is the dollar amount associated with getting every refugee who's school age back in school, and are there foreign assistance dollars that can be commandeered away from existing allocations towards that as a sort of long-term investment? On the opposition websites, it's another sort of criticism of sort of old ways of thinking about foreign assistance, which is the modern day office is a website, right? The modern day staff are followers, who are sort of attracted to a nifty website or digital image and so forth. And I think we need to think about how we empower civil society with the type of digital capabilities that they don't necessarily have. And then the last point, just on sort of what do you call it? I feel like for too many years, I've been in the room where we've spent hours and hours agonizing over what do we call it? Violent Islamist extremism, violent Islamic extremism, IS, ISIS, ISIL. I'm not sure it actually matters that much. What I do believe is that if they were a fly on the wall listening to us agonize over what we call it, they would be so excited that this is how we were spending our time.
I like most council events. I especially liked the quality of our panel and the comments tonight. So please join me in thanking all three of you.